Good morning and welcome to today's webinar. Today's topic, best practices for a newly remote workforce. My name is Paul Federico, Vice President, Corporate and Member Relations for GCP, the Greater Cleveland Partnership. We want to make sure today's presentation is valuable for you and interactive as possible. So we ask you to take a moment to see where you can submit all questions. Simply click on the question button in the corner in the control panel and type your question there. Then press send. We will be taking questions during the presentation, and I will be relaying them to the esteemed panel. Excited to say that all our panelists are proud members of the Greater Cleveland Partnership. For those of you who don't know, we are the region's economic development organization and Chamber of Commerce, and the largest chamber in the country. Now to our panelists. Colin Jennings, partner at Squire Patton Boggs. He serves as primary outside counsel for global compliance work, as well as outside cyber counsel for the state of New Jersey. Next, we have Erica Johnson, associate at Squire Patton Boggs, who advises companies on cybersecurity risks, internal compliance measures, and incident response protocols. Next, we have Darren Haynes, Senior Vice President, Global Consulting at MCPC, who leads consulting services, sales, and channel strategy for projects spanning security, end user computer, mobile, and cloud technologies. And finally, we have Christopher Pruitt, a security principal with MCPC. He advises companies on cybersecurity, privacy, compliance, and incident response strategies. And as I turn it over to Colin, I want to remind you to type your questions as you have them, and we will relay them to the panel. Colin, it's all yours.
All right. Good morning. Thank you. We've got on the screen the agenda we're going to talk about today, and what we want to focus on is really the new landscape that's associated with the pandemic and really the change to remote from work. The companies that have been able to do so have been rapidly changing to the remote from work environment. And as you're focusing on sort of maintaining your business and ensuring you're continuing to contact with your customers, your suppliers, and everyone else you need to work with to conduct your business, one of the things you've inadvertently done is opened up your cybersecurity environment to threats. So what we want to do is talk about the new landscape and then considerations for how to adapt your workforce. How do you best sort of respond to the new normal, particularly in the cybersecurity environment? Then talk about what we should do for a cybersecurity audit. How should you really assess the issues that you're dealing with? And then how do you educate your workforce on cyber hygiene? What should your workforce be aware of to really mitigate and address these risks? We're going to cover each of these topics separately. We're going to really rely heavily on the experts from MCPC to talk about some of the technical pieces. Then Erica and I will talk about some of the legal pieces that you'd be thinking about. And as Paul said, please ask questions. We want this to be interactive and helpful, and we'll leave a little bit of time at the end as well. So let's start talking about what is the new landscape. As we all know, everyone has been moving to stay-at-home orders as a result of the governor's orders. That companies really responded very quickly to this environment and really took advantage of the technology that's available in order to allow workforces to work at home using either company devices, bring your own devices, all of those types of things. And what we need to do is really think about how to best protect your business as you're moving forward. Two of the most common techniques include a VPN, a virtual private network, or a virtual desktop. These are really, I think, important first pieces in your effort to protect your environment, but that's really only the beginning part. We're going to talk now about sort of other things that you should be doing in addition to trying to utilize a VPN or remote desktop to really maximize the protection for your environment. And one of the things that you need to think about is, how does this really impact? Folks are saying, okay, I understand my cybersecurity environment is at risk, but why and how? What really has happened is that you've opened up new doors to your network, new doors to your environment, particularly your organizational email and sort of access to your organizational network, client data, human resources data, financial information. All of that has incredible value to potential attackers. They want to get that information, your client data, for cybersecurity risks, including data privacy, taking use of it for phishing attacks, all of those things where they can take this data and monetize it through identity theft or fictitious emails to cause transfers to occur when you didn't intend them, so fraud on your environment. All of those things are happening all the time, every day, and we want to make sure that you're really paying attention to those issues. And so how do we really address this new environment? We need to look at what are your cybersecurity vulnerabilities, and then make sure that your workforce understands what those new risks and how they can really respond to those new risks. And really what it is how do you make sure you control access to your user accounts? So sort of keep your front door and your windows closed so that folks aren't able to access your network and cause havoc by either stealing the information or causing someone in your organization to make a mistake and ultimately transfer funds or information out that shouldn't have been done. So with that sort of basic overview, we'll turn things over to Chris and Darren to talk about sort of what are those really specific risks associated with the new landscape.
Sure, thanks, Colin. I think things have been fairly interesting. One, how companies have been able to react over the last couple of months. What we've seen from what the internet is able to see. A lot of companies have decided to put servers and applications directly out on the internet, opening new risks to them, but they are trying to support workers who are working from home. They may not have had the VPN technology or secure virtual desktop environments to be able to provide. But what we've seen, these types of environments, putting them on the internet, allowing people, employees, contractors, whomever, to access with a username and password are getting broken into. The attacks have not stopped. Phishing attacks have not stopped. I'm part of a counter threat intelligence team that has been monitoring any COVID-related domains that have popped up over the last 8 weeks, and we've seen over 100,000 different domains. Some of them are trying to sell masks and other equipment, potentially fraudulently. You as an organization may be trying to buy PPE for your employees. You may put an order in and it may not go anywhere. There are many sites that are trying to associate themselves with other companies. One that I'd seen and referenced, Bayer-COVID19.com, clearly trademark infringement on a large pharmaceutical organization, but nothing really stopping someone from buying that domain name. Lawyers have to get engaged as far as takedowns, getting those, but in the short term, it is risk to organizations, partner organizations, customer organizations, or just even people. Employees of your own organizations may be getting emails from these, and how are you handling them? It's a much tougher task on security teams the last 8 weeks.
And what kind of attacks are you typically seeing? Are it phishing attacks, malicious websites? What are the types of attacks you're seeing? Just so that we can get a little specific in terms of the threat actors and what they're doing.
Primarily phishing. There are direct attacks on infrastructure. Over the weekend, Cisco released new patches for their VPN appliances, Cisco ASA. That's a concern. It's potential to affect availability of VPN servers for companies, where right now, 80 to 90% of your employee population may be working from home. If those goes down, you have availability issues. But phishing is, it works, it's out there, and it's what most attackers are using.
All right. And are you also seeing, so we've got on the screen sort of the three primary attack vectors, the encryption of data, which is ransomware, the data breach where they access or take or exfiltrate data, and then what we were just talking about, impersonating an email account user, conduct social engineering or phishing attack to really get into the network. Are these the three primary areas that you're seeing? And you said that there's been a shift to phishing, but are you seeing all three pretty actively right now?
Definitely. On the ransomware front, there are a couple of newer strains that are out there. There are a number of groups, say 9 different groups primarily, who are doing ransomware. A couple of them have lowered attacking healthcare organizations, so they're not spending as much time. They may be healthcare organizations may get caught in a net, much like a fish from a fisherman. But attacks are still going on. The bad guys haven't taken much time off. If anything, now they have even more leverage for doing what they're doing.
Yeah, we've seen that they're taking a lot of advantage of sort of the uncertainty and the anxiety, and particularly, like you said earlier, setting up fictitious sites that appear to be related to COVID response or something like that. So people click on those, they can install Trojans or other types of programs that are ultimately precursors to a ransomware attack, which is where the attacker will actually encrypt your entire environment and then actually sell you access back to your data, or they will use that access to steal information like your customer data or your employee data in order to commit fraud on your customers or on your employees, or to attack identity theft. And then the phishing attacks have been just through the roof. I read a statistic where compared to this time last year, they're up 150%, the phishing attacks. And they're very persistent and they're very sophisticated. And what they do is they will compromise your account, submit an email that looks like it's from someone within your organization, and cause someone to do something that is not consistent with what you're trying to do with your organization. So they'll share information, or they'll say that we need to change banking information so that you make payments to the wrong account, or they'll cause a payment somewhere else, which really creates a lot of havoc because basically you've been robbed by someone who's impersonating someone within your organization. So they're really complicated attack vectors, and they cause enormous issues within the business. And so what we wanted to talk about today is how do we avoid these problems, and how do you really adapt to this new normal?
Sure. And it comes down to, attackers are trying to monetize your information.
Mm-hmm.
Darren?
Absolutely, right. In any way, shape they can. And oftentimes the attacks aren't one at a time. Oftentimes they will, once they're in your system, they'll try any number of different ways to attack. And Darren, I think I heard your voice when we spoke over you, so I apologize. Go ahead.
Sure, no problem, Colin. One of the things I was going to mention as well, just so the audience understands some of the other things that are happening out there around ransomware, is this whole concept of ransomware as a service. So this is something that's cropped up, and there was recently a New York Times article about this. I'm just going to read a quick blurb from that article, and I think this really illustrates some of the things that are happening. So security experts said ransomware has evolved into an industry with hundreds of gangs vying for the most lucrative victims. Some hackers have specialized in ransomware as a service, writing the victim-facing software and selling it to others through the so-called dark web. They have even built out customer service centers to deal with victims and their payments. So when you hear about things like that, many times I think we have this notion that some of these attacks are being conducted, or maybe by the FBI's most wanted, and some of the individuals that are out there that we're able to read about. But the reality is, with the advent of some of these things like ransomware as a service, now you have individuals with very modest or limited technical skills are able to carry out these attacks. And as long as they have access to a list of email addresses that they can run through their systems, they become one of our primary threat vectors that we need to be on the lookout for. So just making sure that everybody understands how broad and pervasive this issue really is.
No, that's good context. And so they're becoming more aggressive and more sophisticated. I will tell you that the phishing and other attacks that Erica and I have seen on behalf of our clients, they're not simple. They're very sophisticated. You can't really tell a real email from a false email. So it really is important to make sure that folks are on guard all the time. So really, what can businesses do to adapt? That's really sort of what we want to focus our time on today. Sort of what do you need to be doing to adapt to this new normal and focus on the new challenges that face you on top of everything else that's going on with COVID-19 and the economic impact. So a couple of things that you need to be thinking about for your workforce are, one, like we've been talking about, expect cybersecurity threats. It's going to happen. We've heard, Darren and I and others have presented with various FBI agents. They always say it's not an issue of when you'll be, if you'll be attacked, it's when you'll be attacked. And so you need to be on constant sort of alert, monitoring your network, paying attention to those vulnerabilities, making sure you understand what it is, and keeping up to date and paying attention. So it really is take a look, assess your system, do that audit, understand how your system is working. One of the things that you have to understand is with this change to remote to work, ultimately you've changed the way your IT system is, or your IT environment is working. You've opened new threats, new vulnerabilities, new things you need to think about. Think about, if a lot of us have children at home with us, they're on your computer, they're looking at what should be a children's site, a site you as an adult would never go to. Some of those sites are malicious sites that are actually implanting malicious software on the machines. All of those things are new pathways into your machine and then ultimately into the work environment that you need to be really thoughtful about. So do the audit, take a look at what is the new IT environment, understand it, understand which devices people are using on your system, make sure, and we'll talk a little bit about BYOB, bring your own device and all other protections about it a little bit later, but really understand those. The other piece is look at your policies and procedures. Do they make sense for a remote workforce? Do people even know what your policies and procedures are? What are your cybersecurity protocols? Understand those so that folks really understand the risks. A little bit of training and education is really invaluable in this space. And then the other piece is really figure out what the vulnerabilities are and then actually address them. I will tell you that when we respond to a data breach, oftentimes they exploit a known vulnerability. For example, a patch that wasn't executed on a web-facing server or something like that. Little things like that, just a little crack in your environment is enough for the attackers to get through. Really identify what those vulnerabilities are, be methodical about them, and close those doors. And then again, train your workforce on phishing and social engineering attacks. Make sure they're paying attention to when they get an email asking them to provide information or really understand what's going on before they send money somewhere, change a bank account or anything like that. And one of the simple fixes is make sure folks know what's an external email and what's an internal email, because oftentimes that'll pay more attention to an external email. But as we talk about, once the threat actors are behind your firewall and in your system, what they will do is they'll set up commands or rules in your email account and actually impersonate someone within your organization. And so it's really important for folks to be on guard, because even an email that looks exactly 100% like one of your internal emails, if you've been compromised, the attackers can make it look like your CEO is asking someone to send $100,000 to an account, unless you sort of really have processes in place to make sure that people are checking and confirming before that money is sent. It's very difficult to get that money back. And I will tell you, it happens day after day after day, and it's really hard to get the money back. It's better to have that protection on the front end. And then just make sure your folks know what are their cyber hygiene best practices. Make sure they're being safe online. Make sure that they're doing all the things they need to do to protect your environment. Erica, anything to add to sort of these basic considerations?
No, that's it. I don't have anything else to add, Colin.
Okay, thank you. So let's start with a cybersecurity audit. Really sort of take a step back and take a look at your environment. How are you using your environment? What vulnerabilities are there? What machines are connecting to your environment? And how are they using those machines? What access do various individuals have? One of the really important issues is, and we can't stress this enough, understand what third parties have access to your system and how far their authority goes within your systems. Really pay attention to access and control. That's one of the things that ultimately do individuals have the access that they need, or do they have more than they need? It's amazing when we post-breach, when we go back and look at how these attacks happen, oftentimes it's just a matter of not putting additional controls or layers or segments within your network to make sure that if someone gets into the network, that it's not what they call a flat network, that once you're in, you can continue to move throughout the network. What you want to do is make sure you really understand what your environment looks like, who has access where and who's in your environment. So monitor logs, really pay attention to what's going on in your environment. That's critically important. And one of the things that we think is also very helpful is when you do these assessments, do it with your in-house counsel or your outside counsel, because if it's done at the direction of counsel, it's privileged. Because one of the issues that we've seen repeatedly is that there will be an assessment done. The assessment will talk about 5 or 6 or 10 different things that the company should be doing to correct and improve its environment. And because of budgets, times, priorities, things like that, the changes don't occur. And then ultimately an attack does happen. And oftentimes the attack happens through one of the attack vectors or one of the vulnerabilities identified by the cybersecurity team. And it's an awkward conversation to have with your insurers, with your board, with other folks, without sort of having that protection and control around that information, so that you can really control the narrative and explain it, because mistakes do happen. But if it's privileged, and then you ultimately, if you get into litigation or something like that, you may not have to produce that report that's showing the vulnerabilities that you didn't do. It's one of those things where a little bit of prevention is valuable, but you also want to make sure that you protect against the worst case scenario, and that if you aren't able to kind of close all those vulnerabilities before something happened, at least it's privileged and you can kind of work through the narrative rather than having the document that you've created used against you in litigation or some other type of engagement with insurers or someone else. So it's really important to think about that. And then the other piece is think about third parties. Having a third party come in, an independent vulnerability assessment is helpful. Your IT team is really busy right now focusing on maintaining the network. They also know your network in and out. They're not going to take an independent kind of hard view. They're going to think that the operation of the IT environment is sufficient, or that they know it well enough. Having someone with a new set of eyes and really sort of focusing on cybersecurity as opposed to just managing the system can prove invaluable, because they understand how the attackers work, and it really does bring a new perspective and a new sort of way to assess the system to make sure that all of those vulnerabilities are identified and hopefully closed before anything adverse happens. So Darren and Chris, why don't you maybe walk us through what is a cybersecurity audit, how does it really work, and how do you sort of interact with the IT department and other folks within the business to get those assessments done?
Fire away, Chris. You can take this first one.
You got it. So, assessments are incredibly important. I think a lot of IT people are, firefighters. They're running around, they're trying to maintain availability. They're trying to, get things to end users, whether it's functionality, availability, performance. Security is often left off of the table. Having, and it's management's due diligence, and management should be the one who are trusting but verifying that IT is doing what they need to do to reduce risk to the organization, protect data, ensure compliance, and any regulatory compliance. So many organizations that we partner with, or client organizations that we perform assessments for, there are technical assessments, penetration tests, vulnerability assessments, more kind of, do you have everything configured properly today? Do you have good protections? Are you patching things? And then we have more governance related. So overall, how are you managing it? Policies, procedures, network security controls, how are you organized from a security perspective, incident response programs, third-party risk management programs. Security is very wide, it's very deep, and we work with our client organizations to determine where they're strong, where they're weak. And typically this is aligning to some standard framework, whether it's NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology from the US government, the NIST 853. It's a large set of controls, and we'll kind of go through best practices. ISO 27001, more of an international standard. COBIT, PCI is a standard, HIPAA for our healthcare organizations, HIPAA and high tech. So that there are a lot of third-party security frameworks that may be tied to a specific locale or industry. We'll use those as the benchmark or the framework that we will assess the client organization. From there, kind of interviews, evidence gathering, sample testing, and we provide a report where they're strong, where they're weak, and what their roadmap is to improve, based on criticality. What are the most critical things that you need to do in short term, near term, midterm, and long term to really improve what you're doing?
And Colin, if you go to the next slide, I think we have a couple of topics there as well. So the main takeaway here is we're having a conversation around the security patches that are relevant to your organization and need to be installed. And I know this is something that we're going to focus on a little bit later in our conversation as it relates to cyber hygiene, but patching is one of the primary ways to ensure that your systems will not be compromised, or in the event they are compromised, that you're going to be able to limit that compromise. The reality is that on average, it takes companies about 102 days to patch all known vulnerabilities. From my perspective, that window is just way too big, and we have to find a way to shrink that. And I can speak from my days as a CIO, I will tell you this, patching is hard work. It's gut-wrenching work. It's hard to make sure that the patches are out there and that they've taken care of. So one of the primary recommendations I have to a lot of our customers is to look at outsourcing the patching to a managed security service provider, and really an organization that specializes in that, an organization that can come in and provide dashboards and things of that nature. I know for us at MCPC, that is a growing piece of our business. It's growing dramatically. It's really taken off as organizations have had to work at home. And the other takeaway here is many times when we talk about patching these vulnerabilities, we are focused in on the operating system level, whether that's a Mac, whether that's a Windows device, what have you. The piece that you really need to be cognizant of is patching third-party applications. So organizations in general will do a pretty good job of the primary security patches for the OS, but one of the things that gets neglected are the third-party applications that need to be patched as well. And those become huge, huge vulnerabilities inside of organizations. So this concept of patching, and again, we'll come back to it later when we discuss cyber hygiene, I cannot emphasize enough the importance of this area.
All right, thank you, Darren. I think one other piece that we see is sort of really making sure that the company has, as part of the audit, just paying attention to what are your policies and procedures, what are you doing? So Erica, can you walk us through that piece, please?
Absolutely. And I think that's actually a really good, important place to start, is that, a comprehensive, holistic cyber audit is not simply just from an IT perspective, but it really is diving in deep into your policies and procedures, and understanding that now in these unprecedented times, these policies and procedures, they weren't drafted in anticipation of this pandemic. And so it's really now taking a look at these policies and procedures from the lens of where we are and maybe where we're going to continue to go. One of those key policies is absolutely has to start with your incident response plan. Now, for those who don't know what an incident response plan, it's essentially a document that outlines how are you going to identify cyber incidences, what's your plan to responding to, and really focuses on what are the procedures that you need to follow to ensure that you're limiting these attacks. Now, incident response plans, they differ considerably based on the organization, and they absolutely should be tailored to your unique risks. But generally, an incident response plan is going to develop your team, so your incident response teams, including generally those members will be human resources, general counsel, your IT team, and it'll also discuss how you guys go ahead and communicate. And that's a really important point. As you look at your policy, as you look at this policy now, think through how would you actually execute this incident response plan. Now that we've all gone to a remote work environment, you can't just walk down the hall to your general counsel or to your IT and say, hey, what's the next step? Let's get the team in a conference room. Let's work through this together. We just don't have that opportunity. And so what what companies might want to do now is actually consider doing a dry run of their incident response plan, and think things through. If there is an incident and we need to contact our insurance company, for example, do we have a hard copy of our insurance policy that maybe our system's encrypted? We can't get to our documents. If it comes to the point where we think we need to contact some of our third parties, well, do we have a copy of these contracts so that we can understand our contractual notification obligations? There's a lot of things that you wouldn't necessarily think through unless you actually sit down with your incident response team and do a dry run. So that would be a good recommended start. That take a look at your incident response plan. Does your team each have a copy of it in front of them? And then start working through those potential holes and frankly roadblocks, and come up with ways to work around those. I mean, as a basic example, if you guys can't all walk down the hall, how are you to communicate? Do you have each other's contact information? Things like those that you can take a step back now and work through will really go a long way in making sure that policy is updated for your new operating environment. And so I briefly touched on your insurance policy. This is, it's a really important measure to help mitigate your risk. However, a lot of these policies were put in place before you had this huge influx to teleworking. So now potentially your risk profile has changed significantly. One thing you might want to consider is working with your broker and understanding whether or not you have enough coverage to properly cover your increase in your cyber risks.
This is Paul. Thanks, Erica. I do have a question I'm going to throw out to the group.
Okay.
As a small business with limited funds and a single IT person, if I had to focus my efforts in just a couple areas, what would those areas be?
Chris, Darren, you want to take that one?
Yeah. I think we see this often. I think a lot of mid-market on down size businesses, they limited budget, they're focused on building their widget. They want to ship it, invoice, collect funds, buy more material, make more widgets. And in security, if it wasn't a nuisance, they probably wouldn't care about it too much. To me, there's a number of practical things. You should be aligning your investments, people, process, technology with your risks. Phishing is the biggest issue that's out there. So educate your employees, have good email filtering, and in the event that something happens, have strong endpoint protections. Configuration, patching both go a long way to preventing attacks, and then strong endpoint defense. There's antivirus is essentially a dead technology. So, from a very practical perspective, those are the things that I suggest focusing on.
All right.
And I would say that I agree wholeheartedly with everything that Chris just ran through there. And the one piece that I would emphasize a little bit, and I think this is something that we're going to talk about later in the conversation, is around training. So that is an area, we kind of joke about this, and any one of us panelists or anybody out there that's listening would fall into this category. One of the biggest threat vectors is what's sitting between the keyboard and the chair, which is all of us. And again, we'll get into this a little bit later, but cannot overemphasize the importance of training and beginning to understand the nature of some of these attacks that are out there, how they're occurring, and what you can do to really protect yourself and minimize the chance that these things will happen.
Right. No, and that's a great question. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, guys. Well,
No,
one thing I was gonna say is that, especially from a small business perspective where maybe resources might be limited, the return on your investment for just spending the time with your employees and going through some real life examples, or really tailoring some potential examples that your employees could see, just from a cost benefit perspective, that's a great way to start.
No, absolutely. And that question is a great transition to sort of the next part of our presentation, which is really how do you train and raise awareness within your employees, building on the point Darren made that the risk is really your employees, because what the whole point of the training and awareness is to make sure that let them think for like half a second more before they click on a link or open an email, and that could be really invaluable. Just one thing to close the loop on what Erica said about insurance. Cyber insurance is really important, and it's one of the best ways if you're ultimately breached or subject to a phishing attack or something like that. Cyber insurance is usually your best road for recovery. One thing, think about what is actually covered. Oftentimes it only covers a breach. It won't cover social engineering or phishing attacks. Does it have what's called first-party coverage? Does it cover your loss? Does it cover employees using their home machines or working from their home network? These are all things that it's important to really understand the scope of the coverage that you have, because I will tell you, we have lots of conversations with people who think cyber coverage is much broader than it really is. You need to really look at the terms of your policy, understand what first party and third party coverages you have. Like Erica said, talk to your broker, but understand what's covered and make sure you understand what crime and fraud coverage you also have, because that usually works hand in hand with your cyber policy. Sometimes your kidnap and ransom policy that's part of your commercial policy or a endorsement or something like that will provide coverage for ransomware. It's really important to sort of understand the scope of your coverage to make sure you understand it, because that's one of the best ways to sort of recover financially from an attack. So one of the key takeaways on top of what Darren and Chris and Erica just said about sort of priorities, one of them is really making sure you understand your cyber policy, because that is really the insurance you're going to need if an event happens. The next piece we want to talk about is sort of thinking about your policies and procedures, is making sure that your employees really understand what's required of them. They're the front lines. They're the people between, like Darren said, the keyboard and the chair. Those are the folks that you really need to make sure we have in place. So strong password requirements, 12 characters or more, different symbols, numbers, caps, all those things. Make it a complicated password. Make sure you're not reusing or sharing passwords. I can't tell you how many breach events we've had to respond to that are because people either reused passwords, used very simple passwords like password or 1234 or something like that. Your organization should not permit those weak passwords. And ultimately make sure that folks aren't sharing them or multiple users aren't sharing them. Make sure it's unique users and things like that for passwords. Multi-factor authentication, MFA, is really important right now. It's a way for you to get multiple entry into your system is limited by either not just a password, but ultimately through a random code that's sent to a smartphone or a token or something else that shows that you've got multiple steps before someone can access your system. That's really important because it's much harder for an outside actor to compromise your system if you have MFA, if you have multi-factor authentication, end-to-end encryption, like Darren and Chris said. Make sure that you've got encryption both at rest and in motion of your data. Make sure that your devices are encrypted, and make sure that you've got endpoint monitoring in place so that you're really paying attention to what folks are doing on those machines. So the endpoints is just a fancy word, an IT word for your computers. What's going on in your computers? If you have that endpoint monitoring, people are really you get real-time information about what's going on your machines and can stop an attack. VPN connections are really important, but make sure that people actually encrypt their routers and make sure that they actually put passwords on their routers and make sure that they're paying attention to what's going on their VPN connections. Make sure you monitor the connections and frankly monitor the logs so you really know what's going on in your system. And then on BYOD, bring your own device. It's really nice that people are able to use their smartphones or their home computers or things like that. But again, that really creates new vulnerabilities for your organization because it's a new computer. That computer has different access points. It's used different websites. It may not have, your work computers may have all of the patching done like Darren said and Chris said, and it may have antivirus. It may have some of the other things that we've talked about here. Antivirus, like they said, is a start, but it certainly isn't something. It's going to get circumvented pretty quickly by sophisticated threat actors. But really understanding what devices people are using, making sure they're encrypted, making sure the operating systems are up to date. All of those things are critically important because ultimately that new device, that personal device, is a new door into your system that needs to make sure it's got the same protection that it does on all of your other devices. And then, like Erica talked about in some detail, really take a look at your policies, pay attention to how your new work environment has changed, and really what should we be doing in terms of making sure that those policies are up to date and frankly communicated to employees in a way that they really understand them. And that awareness training is really, really important. One thing that we've been doing is having folks sign remote worker agreements, which is basically an agreement where they say, yes, we understand the policies and procedures and the cybersecurity protocols in place for remote working. We've read the policies, we've read the incident response plan. We understand that we're responsible for good cyber hygiene on using company devices and the devices that hook into the network, that we're paying attention to the websites that we're using, that we're looking at the emails that we're clicking on, all of those things. It's just another way to raise awareness for your workforce, because they're your first line of defense and also your primary weakness. So really anything you can do to raise their awareness and their just threat awareness is really going to be critically important. And so one of the things that we've talked about repeatedly is phishing attacks, and what are those? And so I think what we want to focus now on is really focusing on how do you train your workforce to respond to phishing attacks, and how can you sort of minimize that threat to make sure that there are no issues. So Erica, can you walk through that process?
Absolutely. So one thing we have noticed is, phishing attacks have always been a very a successful attack vector. And so what we've noticed is that threat actors are now using this opportunity to use, to really mask these phishing attacks. So, I think a lot of us have now seen our emails flooded with, emails about, hey, changes in activities, changes in closings. And so we're getting a lot more of an uptick in emails from people that we may not otherwise would have received emails from. And so we've seen that as a trend, that the threat actors are really using this opportunity of information chaos, if you will, to send more phishing attacks. And so that's why really that this is a good opportunity to step back and make sure your force is really well trained, as we've already been harping on. So some of those characteristics that you can make sure that your workforce is really aware of is really to look at who is the sender. Typically, or what you can do to help your workforce is you can have some type of technology that says when an email is from an external party. So that'll help really alert your employees to know whether or not to really hone in on who the sender is, but really train them to say, look at exactly who the sender is, particularly in the context of spoofed email addresses. I think Chris mentioned this earlier in our presentation, that anyone really can sign up for a domain name, and then they can, for example, they'll take your company's domain name and they'll switch a word, or they'll add a D on it, or add an S, and then they'll find your employee's name online and say, okay, john.smith at what looks like you're close to your domain name. And so then your employee is thinking that they are getting a legitimate email from somebody inside your network, when in fact, really it's someone from outside their network. So that's a common way for employees to kind of get tripped up, is by thinking, okay, this is a recognized person, but in fact, threat actors have just switched or created new domain names. So that's one thing to really train them on, is to look at that domain name and really make sure that it in fact is from either your organization or an organization that they know and recognize. Another common factor are misspelled or incorrect grammar. So, unfortunately, many of these threat actors are not native English speakers, maybe from other countries. And so you will see that there's just a slight change and something just doesn't look just right. So have your employees really look out for, if something doesn't look right, hey, take a good pause, check the domain name, check the sender, but really look out for that, those incorrect spelling or grammars. Another common use is they'll send a generic email. In fact, I think I got one, I've definitely seen these in the past, where they'll send an email from accounting and they'll send it as accounting, or sign it generically as HR. Oh, please click on this link. You need to update your records. It's it's just so common, but unfortunately it's successful. And now they're using this opportunity for chaos and misinformation to get your workers to click on something. So for example, they can't walk down to HR and say, hey, Sally, is this a correct email? You just don't have that opportunity. So they're capitalizing on this by using a very well-known and very, unfortunately, successful attack vector. And to really train your staff that, you know, if it just doesn't look right, really take a second. And really by doing this training, all you're doing is instilling a culture of ensuring that people are thinking about best hygiene practices. The more you talk about it, the more they're going to be aware, and the more they're going to really be hyper vigilant in doing all these, looking for these common characteristics that I just went through. And this is kind of like the policies and procedures that we talked about. Well, what are your policies and procedures for having your employees respond to potential phishing attacks? You know, for us, we forward it to our IT security, team. But do you have your own policies and procedures in place for when your employee receives a potential phishing attack? If not, that's something you might want to think about implementing right now and making sure and training your workforce on it. So, you know, one thing to make sure you let them know is definitely, if it's an unknown, you don't know the sender, something's really weird about it, don't click on any links. You know, you can have a policy to forward it to your IT department or delete the email, whatever it is. Come up with a plan and make sure you've trained your workforce on it. Another thing that this is what Colin talked about earlier, and I think he's going to talk about more in the next slide, is verifying over the phone. If you get an email from someone you think is accounting saying, hey, look, you know, we need to update your pay information, get on the phone and call accounting. But that's part of your policies and procedures. Do your employees know who to call? Have you given them that information? Is it easily available to them? Thinking through ways that you can make things easier for your employees, that's going to go a long way. So the takeaway from this slide is really twofold. One, it's really instilling a culture of cyber hygiene and frankly awareness. And just by having that conversation with your employees, they're just by default going to be more aware. And then two, if you don't have any policies and procedures in place, or they're really not adequately adapted to the situation, go ahead and update those. And again, another part of your training is really to think about, it's one thing to kind of train in the abstract, but it's much more effective if you can tailor to either to your audience specifically. So say, for example, you just want to have a conversation with those who you think are going to be part of and touching on your financial information. Your training should be really focused on what are those potential phishing attacks going to look like. Someone maybe potentially to be impersonating one of your vendors and say, hey, look, we've just changed our financial payment plan or our financial payment information. Please send it to this address now. Well, part of your training should be, okay, pick up the phone and verify. So a really effective way to train is not just to train the abstract, but really think through how would these malicious actors be attacking us? And one thing to really highlight, and that's been highlighted on the DOJ lately, Department of Justice, is we've seen an uptick in using, legitimate government, either links or names to try to get people to click on websites. So, for example, the one they put out was one with the World Health Organization, or, getting people to try to click on and learn more information. So, really just tailoring that training is really going to go a long way. And as a follow-up, if it fits within your resources and your budget, think about doing a internal phishing test. Send something out as a good way to follow up. It's really allowing your employees to put in place all the things that you have taught them. So those are some good ways that you can really, from a cost-benefit analysis, really going a long way in protecting your network.
All right. Thanks, Erica. And we're gonna switch over now to another, social engineering is another descriptor for attacks like phishing, or where they've gathered enough information about your employees, your business, your customers on open source through the internet, Facebook, things like that. And they ultimately try to impersonate someone else to force someone to do something that they wouldn't otherwise do, like share information, make a transfer, something like that. So one of the things is really make sure your employees pay attention to who are the senders. Is it the right person? is it an odd or unusual request? Right now, sort of, if something doesn't feel right, they should stop. Like Erica said, pick up the phone, talk to folks, because what the threat actors are doing right now is they're taking advantage of the fact that folks are remote, trying to do their job, manage their personal lives and everything else. And so people want to move quickly. And by moving quickly, they're taking advantage of those mistakes by tricking people. So really slow down, make sure that before you make a transaction, before you share information, confirm it through a source other than email oftentimes. But again, really most important, don't open unknown links or attachments, verify requests over the phone. Just be hyper vigilant right now, because frankly, the efforts are really at an all-time high. And then ultimately, train your folks. Like, pay attention to if there's a change for financial payment information or something like that, make sure they pay attention. If there's a new business deal that you're going to get involved with that you haven't heard of, and the CEO is sending an email to fund it for the first time, call and check. It's maybe an awkward conversation with the CEO, but I will tell you that conversation is a lot less awkward if you wire out $100,000 or $1 million, and then ultimately you have to explain why to the CEO and to the board and others why that money was sent without verifying. It really is, trust but verify, slow down, pay attention, because it's critically important at this point, because the attackers are really sophisticated and very, very good at what they do. The other piece is sort of, again, policies and procedures, making sure the employees are aware of your requirements and the handling of sensitive information. That's personal information, healthcare information, financial information, the crown jewels, your trade secrets, your customer lists, your know-how, your product information, all of those things. We've seen a huge uptick of efforts trying to steal trade secret information, in addition to personal information that can be used for identity theft, like social security numbers, like credit card numbers, like all of those types of things. Then also bank account information. Really pay attention to who's getting access to that information. Make sure that you've got sort of people paying attention to access to that information, limiting it to a need to know, and really being protective of that information. You wouldn't let someone just rifle through your files at the office. Why would you give someone access to your files on the internet? And the other piece is, again, those remote worker agreements, I think, are really good at the end of some training and awareness, just to really get some personal accountability for complying with your policies and procedures. It's a small step, but I think it really does get some accountability to your employees. They really understand how serious and important it is for the company. And it's a simple gesture, but it can really put it top of mind for them so they don't make a mistake. And the other thing is, be careful with sort of removable media like thumb drives, make sure they're encrypted, all of those types of things. It's really easy to lose track of those. And ultimately, folks will take advantage of whatever information they can get a hold of, unfortunately. So the next piece is sort of on focusing on cyber hygiene. How do you focus on sort of technical controls and things like that? So for this section, I'm going to turn it over to Chris and Darren.
Darren, you want to start?
Sure. So I think we teed this up a little bit earlier in the conversation, and this really gets to really practicing good cyber hygiene. And what we mean by that is, let's make sure that we're doing what we need to do from an endpoint protection perspective. And that Chris made this comment earlier that, in a sense, antivirus may be dead. What we're talking about with endpoint protection is we need to be able to look at behavioral analysis, artificial intelligence, and ensuring that you have that layer inside of endpoint protection. Then doing things like multi-factor authentication. We've seen a number of breaches, for example, with Office 365. Organizations inherently believe that by moving to Office 365, and as of yesterday, now it's called Microsoft 365, that they are more secure. And on some level they are, but if you're not running multi-factor authentication, it opens up a gigantic door for the perpetrators to come through. We mentioned patching earlier. Monitoring and trying to have a full view through one pane of glass of what's happening in your environment is incredibly important. And then Colin and Erica talked about the importance of having an incident response plan in place and understanding how you're going to react to things. So those are some of the components of what we would call good cyber hygiene. And the one thing that I would say to wrap that up inside of the cyber hygiene conversation is to really share with everybody a real life experience that we had with one of our customers who was not practicing many of these areas. So this is something that I think many of the folks that are listening in probably could relate to. This organization was more of a mid-sized organization, about 1,000 employees, about $400 million in revenue. They were in the process of acquiring another business. The night before they were going to acquire that business, they were ransomwared. We were called in to contain the breach and remediate it. So from a high level, let's talk about what the cost was for that organization. It's about $200,000 in services. Unfortunately, we had to negotiate a ransom on their behalf that was in excess of $250,000. Penalties in place for not closing on time, lost revenue during the remediation. So, you know, I'm a simple math guy. If you take $400 million divided by 365 days a year, it's a little over $1,090,000 a day. So you can quickly see how this breach topped about $2.5 million when it was all said and done for this organization. That falls in line with statistics that we show that shows that a breach is about $3.9 million on average. So this wasn't that far behind it. What were some of the causes behind it? It was, you know, simple cyber hygiene that they were not practicing. Out-of-date endpoint protection, out-of-date patching, poor backup, so they weren't able to recover. You know, had the company had some of those processes in place, and importantly to the item on the slide around incident response, knowing what their plan was and how they were going to execute against it, at a minimum, they would have been able to contain that breach much quicker, and the cost would have been much less dramatic for the organization. So that's a kind of a cautionary tale of an organization, a real live organization that we worked with that did not have proper cyber hygiene in place, and what happened as a result of that.
No, thank you, Darren. And that's a great way to close out the session. Basically, you know, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. A lot of these things we talked about sound simple, but to actually execute them in a way that protects your environment does take some careful planning and methodical approach to protecting your environment and making sure your employees are really aware of the risks and making sure that they're complying with your protocols and your policies to really create that fence around your organization to protect it. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for their time and their information. I think hopefully it's been really helpful. We've got a couple minutes left for questions. I know Paul was going to ask any questions that may have come in, but at this point, we hope that this has been helpful, and we're here to answer any questions. And if you have any questions after the event, our information is available through the PowerPoint here, and we'd be happy to answer any questions you may have after as well.
Oh, you guys did a fantastic job. Thank you very much. Thank you to Darren, Colin, Erica, and Chris. You pretty much answered all the questions as they were coming in, so it was really worked out really well. So well done on the presentation. We hope everyone found today's presentation engaging and informative. If you have any thoughts to share, interested in doing a webinar, membership, sponsorship, just please let us know. You can reach us at vip@gcpartnership.com. We will be distributing the recording of today's session within the next day or so. You can go to gcppartnership.com for a list of all webinars. We also suggest gcpandgear.com for more business services. Thank you all for joining us this morning. This concludes today's session. Thank you again.
Thank you.
Have a great day.